In the frozen hell of December 1944, along the blood-soaked ridges of the Hürtgen Forest where winter fog clung to shattered pine trees like the ghosts of 24,000 dead men, a moment occurred that would challenge everything we think we know about war, humanity, and the invisible threads that connect us even across the most terrible divides. A German Wehrmacht soldier named Friedrich Weber, just 23 years old with frostbitten fingers and a conscience that wouldn't let him sleep, looked down at the broken body of his enemy and made a choice that defied every order, every instinct of survival, every rational thought screaming in his war-torn mind. The American Ranger, Staff Sergeant James Jimmy Donovan from Boston, lay in a crater torn open by an 88mm shell. His right leg mangled below the knee, bone visible through shredded cloth and flesh, his face drained to the color of old newspaper, lips moving in silent prayer or perhaps calling for his mother. Weber couldn't tell which, and it didn't matter because in that instant, crouching behind the skeletal remains of what had once been a barn, watching the young American try to drag himself through mud mixed with blood and snow, Friedrich saw not a soldier in olive drab but something that cut through the propaganda, through the hatred carefully cultivated by years of indoctrination, through the numbing brutality of 3 years on the Eastern Front. He saw his younger brother Klaus, who had died at Stalingrad, and he saw himself, and he saw every frightened boy who'd ever been thrown into the grinding machinery of war. The battle had raged for 6 days straight in this nightmare forest that American GIs called the Death Factory and Germans called the Fleischwolf, the meat grinder, where visibility rarely extended beyond 30 yards through the dense timber, and every tree seemed to hide a sniper, every shadow concealed a mine, and men died in ways so terrible that even hardened veterans wept when they spoke of it years later in hushed voices over whiskey in dim VFW halls. Donovan's squad had been tasked with what the officers euphemistically called a reconnaissance in force, which really meant go get killed finding out where the Germans are, and they'd walked straight into a perfectly positioned MG-42 machine gun nest that had been waiting with Teutonic patience, cutting down 7 of the 12 Rangers in the first brutal seconds. The sound of that gun, firing 1,200 rounds per minute, was like the devil's zipper opening up, and Jimmy had watched his best friend Tommy Kowalski get nearly cut in half, watched the boy from Pittsburgh take 3 rounds in the chest and 1 in the throat, his eyes wide with the terrible surprise of death, and then the 88 had arrived with its characteristic crack boom that you never got used to, the shell landing close enough to flip Jimmy through the air like a rag doll, his consciousness flickering like a faulty light bulb as he hit the frozen ground. Friedrich Weber, who'd been a teacher before the war, who'd once stood in front of 30 children and taught them Goethe and Schiller, who'd believed in education and reason and the essential goodness that might be cultivated in the human soul, had been ordered to hold this position at all costs. His squad leader, a brutal Prussian sergeant named Dietrich who wore the Iron Cross and whose eyes held nothing but the cold acceptance of death, had made it clear that any man who retreated would be shot, and Friedrich had seen him do exactly that 2 weeks prior to a boy from Bavaria who'd broken and run during a mortar barrage. But now, in this moment between heartbeats, between the crackle of rifle fire that echoed through the skeletal forest, Friedrich Weber was faced with a choice that seemed simple on its surface but contained within it all the moral complexity that has tortured philosophers for millennia. Leave the enemy soldier to die a slow, agonizing death in that crater, which would be the tactically sound, militarily correct, personally safe decision, or risk everything. His life, his honor to his comrades, his duty to a nation that had twisted itself into something monstrous, to save a man who, just minutes ago, had been trying to kill him. The temperature was dropping fast as afternoon faded toward the early winter darkness that came so quickly this far north, and Weber knew that even if the Americans' wounds didn't kill him, exposure would do the job within hours, hypothermia shutting down the body system by system while consciousness faded into a deceptive warmth that veterans knew was the last, gentle lie death told before the end. Jimmy Donovan, lying in that crater with the bitter smell of cordite and blood and churned earth filling his nostrils, drifted in and out of consciousness, and when he was awake he thought about absurd things. He thought about his mother's meatloaf, which he'd always claimed to hate but which now seemed like the most perfect food ever created. He thought about the girl he'd kissed behind O'Malley's pub before shipping out, Mary Catherine Sullivan with her red hair and freckles and the way she'd tasted like peppermint. He thought about his kid sister's graduation from high school that he'd missed, and he thought, with the cruel clarity that comes when death approaches, that he was going to die at age 24 in a godforsaken German forest and his body would probably never be found, would rot into the soil and become part of this place that had taken so many lives it seemed almost alive itself, feeding on the young men from both sides who'd been fed into its insatiable maw. Friedrich made his decision in the space between two breaths, not from courage. He would never claim that, would always insist he'd been terrified, but from something deeper, something that predated nationalism and ideology, something primal that connected him to that broken American soldier in a way that transcended the artificial divisions of war. It was simply that he could not watch another human being suffer and die when he had the power to prevent it, could not live with himself if he turned away, could not face whatever came after this life knowing that he'd chosen the easy path of indifference when a harder path of compassion had been available. He moved quickly, before rational thought could paralyze him, sliding down the embankment with his Mauser rifle slung across his back. His heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst through his ribs, fully expecting the crack of an American sniper's rifle or the shout of Sergeant Dietrich demanding to know what the hell he was doing fraternizing with the enemy. Jimmy Donovan's eyes flickered open to see a German soldier sliding into the crater, and his first confused thought was that he was being taken prisoner. His second thought was that the German was going to finish him off with a mercy bullet, and his third thought, which came as Weber gently took his arm and began assessing his wounds with surprising tenderness, was that maybe he'd already died, and this was some strange purgatory where nothing made sense anymore. "American," Friedrich said in heavily accented English learned from books before the war. "You are badly hurt. I will help you." And Jimmy, his mind foggy with pain and blood loss, actually laughed, a short bitter bark that ended in a groan, because the absurdity of the situation. A German soldier offering aid in the middle of a battle seemed like something from a fever dream, and he managed to gasp out, "Why the hell would you do that, you crazy bastard?" Friedrich didn't answer immediately, instead pulling out the field dressing from his own first aid kit and wrapping Jimmy's shattered leg with efficiency that spoke of too much practice. Too many wounded men tended in too many desperate situations, and when he finally replied, his voice was quiet but firm. "Because I have seen enough death, because you are somebody's son, somebody's brother, because if I die today I want God to remember I did at least one decent thing in this indecent war." The forest exploded around them as if the very gods of war were offended by this act of mercy. Machine gun fire raked the tree line, mortars began walking across the ridgeline, and somewhere close by a Panzerfaust lit up the gathering darkness with its distinctive whoosh crack, and Friedrich knew with absolute certainty that they had perhaps 2 minutes to get out of that crater before they both died there. Jimmy Donovan weighed 180 pounds before the war, probably closer to 160 now after months of combat rations and stress. But when Friedrich Weber pulled him up and maneuvered him onto his back in a fireman's carry, that weight seemed impossibly heavy, every step would be agony, and the 40 yards to the relative safety of the German lines might as well have been 40 miles. "Hold on to me, American," Friedrich said, "and do not let go no matter what happens, do you understand?" And Jimmy, his arms wrapped around the German's shoulders, his ruined legs screaming with every movement, managed to whisper, "Yeah, I got you." And the two of them, enemies for the duration of their lives until approximately 2 minutes ago, began the most surreal journey either would ever make, moving across a battlefield where both sides were actively trying to kill them, where Friedrich's fellow Germans would shoot at an American uniform and Jimmy's fellow Rangers would shoot at a German uniform, where the only safe place was the small bubble of space they carried with them, 2 men against the entire mechanized might of modern warfare. Friedrich stumbled almost immediately, his boot catching on a root hidden beneath the snow, and he went down to one knee with a grunt, Jimmy's extra weight driving him toward the ground. But he pushed himself back up through sheer force of will, through the desperate knowledge that stopping meant dying, and he lurched forward into the smoke and chaos, his lungs burning, his legs trembling with exhaustion, his mind reduced to the simple animal imperative of one foot in front of the other. The first bullet came so close that Friedrich felt the displacement of air against his cheek. A supersonic kiss from death itself, and he dodged instinctively, his body moving before his mind could process the danger, zigzagging through the shattered landscape like a drunk man, Jimmy clinging to his back and praying in a continuous stream. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee, blessed art thou among women." The words of his Catholic childhood spilling out unbidden while tracers drew bright lines through the gathering dusk like fallen stars. Sergeant Dietrich saw them coming, saw one of his men carrying an American soldier, and for a moment his finger actually tightened on the trigger of his Luger, murder plain in his eyes, But something stopped him. Perhaps the sheer audacity of what Weber was attempting, perhaps some long-buried spark of humanity that even 3 years of mechanized slaughter hadn't quite extinguished, perhaps just the knowledge that the war was already lost and nothing mattered anymore. And instead of shooting, he actually provided covering fire, his MP-40 chattering into the American positions while screaming, "Covering fire! Covering fire!" to the rest of the squad, and suddenly 6 more German soldiers were shooting not at the American but for him, creating a corridor of bullets through which Friedrich Weber staggered with his impossible burden. On the American side, Lieutenant Marcus Henderson, a West Point graduate who'd learned all about honor and duty in the clean classrooms of the academy, but who'd learned about the reality of war in places with names like Omaha Beach and the Falaise Pocket, saw through his binoculars what was happening, saw one of his rangers on the back of a German soldier, and he made a decision that could have gotten him court-martialed, shouting, "Cease fire! Cease fire on that German soldier! Nobody shoots that man, that's a direct order!" And his rangers, confused but obedient, lowered their weapons while their lieutenant watched something that looked like a miracle happen in real time. Friedrich's legs finally gave out 15 yards from the German line. His body simply refusing to carry the weight any further, muscles pushed beyond their limit, and he crashed to the ground with Jimmy still on his back, both men groaning with pain and exhaustion, lying in a tangle of limbs in the blood-churned mud, and for a terrible moment Friedrich thought he'd failed, thought they'd die there together just feet from safety, but then hands were grabbing them, pulling them toward the German positions, and Sergeant Dietrich, that brutal Prussian with the dead eyes, was helping lift the American soldier, was calling for the medic, was looking at Friedrich Weber with something that might have been respect or might have been incomprehension or might have been both. Jimmy Donovan spent the next 6 hours in a German field hospital, where a Wehrmacht doctor named Kaufmann, who'd taken an oath to heal all men regardless of nationality, worked to save his leg with supplies that were criminally inadequate, with morphine that was running low, with everything improvised and patched together because by December 1944 the German military was a shell of its former self, bleeding out on 2 fronts. But Dr. Kaufmann did his best, and maybe that best was good enough. Because Jimmy kept the leg, though it would never be quite right again, would ache on cold mornings and remind him for the rest of his long life of that December day in the Hürtgen Forest. Friedrich Weber was killed 3 weeks later, on January 9, 1945, during the Battle of the Bulge's final days, when an American artillery barrage caught his unit in the open and a shell fragment took his life so quickly that witnesses said he probably never felt it, never knew the end had come, and he died not knowing that the American ranger he'd saved would spend the next 60 years telling the story of the German soldier who'd carried him to safety, who'd risked everything for a stranger, who'd proven that even in humanity's darkest hours there were still men who chose compassion over convenience, courage over cruelty, mercy over murder. Jimmy Donovan went home to Boston in April 1945, his war over, his leg held together with pins and prayer, and he married Mary Catherine Sullivan, and they had 4 children and 7 grandchildren, and every single one of them grew up hearing about Friedrich Weber, the German teacher who'd become a soldier, who'd become a hero, whose name Jimmy spoke with a reverence usually reserved for saints. 4 years Jimmy tried to find Friedrich's family, writing letters to German authorities, to the Red Cross, to anyone who might help, and finally in 1962 he located Friedrich's sister, Anna Weber Hoffmann, who lived in Frankfurt and who wept when she read Jimmy's letter describing her brother's final act of humanity. And Jimmy sent money to help Anna's children attend university, and the 2 families maintained a correspondence that lasted decades. A friendship born from the ashes of war, proof that even the most terrible conflicts cannot completely destroy the human capacity for connection, for forgiveness, for love. The story might have ended there, a private memory shared between 2 families, but in 1997 a journalist named Robert McKay heard Jimmy tell the story at a VFW hall in Dorchester, and he wrote an article that was picked up nationally, and suddenly Friedrich Weber was being honored, posthumously receiving recognition from the German government, his name added to a memorial for those who'd shown humanity during the war, and Jimmy Donovan, by then 77 years old and moving slowly on that leg that had never quite healed right, traveled to Germany for the ceremony and met Friedrich's nephew, Klaus Weber, who'd been named after Friedrich's brother who died at Stalingrad, and the 2 old men, one American, one German, one the saved, one the nephew of the savior, embraced while cameras flashed and politicians made speeches about reconciliation and healing. But for Jimmy and Klaus it was simpler than that, more profound than any political meaning could capture. It was about remembering a man who'd chosen right when choosing right was nearly impossible, who'd carried his enemy to safety when he could have walked away, who'd proven that in war, which is organized murder on an industrial scale, individual acts of grace still matter, still shine, still remind us that we are more than our worst moments, more than our tribal affiliations, more than the flags we march under or the anthems we sing. Jimmy Donovan died in 2008 at age 88, surrounded by his family, and his last words, spoken in a whisper to his daughter Patricia, were, "Tell them about Friedrich. Tell them he was a good man. Tell them that's what matters. Not that he was German or I was American, but that he was good, that he carried me when he didn't have to, that he saved me." And Patricia has indeed told that story, has written a book about it, has given interviews, has made sure that Friedrich Weber's name lives on, not as a German soldier or as an enemy, but simply as a man who, in the frozen hell of the Hürtgen Forest in December 1944, looked at another human being in pain and could not turn away, could not close his heart, could not choose the easy indifference that war encourages and demands, and instead made the hardest choice of all, to see his enemy as a brother, to risk everything for a stranger, to carry another man's burden when his own was already almost unbearable, and in doing so proved that honor between enemies isn't just possible. It's what separates us from the darkness that war threatens to drown us in. It's the thin line between barbarism and civilization. It's the light that continues to shine decades later, reminding us that in our worst moments, in our most terrible hours, in the depths of mechanized slaughter and ideological hatred, we can still choose mercy, can still choose compassion, can still choose to be fundamentally and defiantly human. But the story doesn't end with death, because stories like this never truly end. They transform, they evolve, they find new life in each generation that hears them and recognizes in them something essential about who we are and who we might become. And so in 2014, on the 70th anniversary of that December day in the Hürtgen Forest, something remarkable happened that proved Friedrich Weber's act of courage had created ripples that continued to spread through time like stones thrown into still water. The United States Army Rangers, in a ceremony attended by German Bundeswehr officers, dedicated a memorial stone at the exact coordinates where Friedrich had carried Jimmy to safety. A simple granite marker with both men's names and both nations' flags, with an inscription that read, "Zwei Soldaten, ein Menschlichkeit," 2 soldiers, 1 humanity. And standing there that cold December morning, watching the snowfall just as it had 70 years before, were members of both families. Jimmy's grandson Michael Donovan, a Marine veteran of Iraq who understood in his bones the weight of what his grandfather and Friedrich had experienced, and Friedrich's great-niece Emma Weber, a doctor from Berlin who'd chosen her profession because of the stories her grandmother Anna had told her about Uncle Friedrich, who'd believed that saving lives was the only sane response to a world gone mad with killing. Michael and Emma had corresponded for months before the ceremony, exchanging photos and letters and stories, building a friendship that neither could quite explain except to say that they felt connected by something deeper than bloodline, connected by the choice their ancestors had made to honor life over death, compassion over hatred. And as they stood together watching the memorial being unveiled, Michael said something that Emma would never forget, his voice thick with emotion. "My grandfather carried Friedrich with him every day of his life. The memory of him, the weight of him, the debt he could never repay. And now I carry them both, and I understand now that this is what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to carry each other across whatever battlefields we face, whatever divides seem impossible to cross. We're supposed to remember that before we're Americans or Germans, before we're soldiers or civilians, before we're anything else, we're human beings who need each other to survive." The ceremony was covered by news outlets around the world, and the footage went viral in that peculiar way that meaningful content sometimes does in our digital age. Millions of people watching this simple memorial service and feeling something stir in their chests, some reminder that we're capable of better than the tribalism and hatred that seems to dominate our headlines. And in the comments section beneath the videos, in a dozen languages, people shared their own stories. A British soldier who'd been helped by an Argentine medic during the Falklands War, a Korean War veteran who'd been given water by a Chinese soldier before being taken prisoner, a nurse from Rwanda who'd hidden both Hutu and Tutsi neighbors during the genocide. Countless small acts of humanity performed in the midst of inhumanity, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of human decency that persists despite everything, that refuses to be extinguished no matter how dark the world becomes. 3 years after the memorial dedication, in 2017, something even more extraordinary occurred. The German government, in partnership with the U.S. Veterans Administration, established the Friedrich Weber Fellowship, a program that brings together young veterans from former enemy nations to work on humanitarian projects, to learn each other's languages and stories, to build the kinds of bridges that might prevent future wars, or at least ensure that if wars come, humanity doesn't become their first casualty. And the first class of fellows included a Syrian refugee who'd served in the Free Syrian Army, an Israeli veteran of the Gaza conflicts, a Ukrainian soldier, a Russian medic, an American who'd done 3 tours in Afghanistan, and a German Bundeswehr officer who'd served in peacekeeping missions across Africa. 6 people who by all rights should have viewed each other with suspicion if not outright hostility, but who instead spent 6 months living together, working together, building a school in Uganda, and learning that the lines we draw between us and them are far more fragile than the connections that bind all human beings in our shared struggle to create meaning and goodness in a universe that often seems indifferent to both. Emma Weber, Friedrich's great-niece, became the director of the Friedrich Weber Fellowship in 2019, and in an interview she gave to Der Spiegel, she said something that captured the essence of why this story matters, why it continues to resonate, why it refuses to be forgotten. My great-uncle Friedrich didn't do something extraordinary because he was extraordinary. He was just a schoolteacher who got drafted into a terrible war, who was frightened and cold and probably wanted nothing more than to go home to his students and his books and his quiet life. But he did something extraordinary because in one crucial moment, he chose to remember that the person suffering in front of him was a person, not an enemy, not another, not a piece on a strategic game board, but a human being with a mother and a future and dreams and fears just like his own. And that choice, that simple but impossibly difficult choice, changed everything, not just for Jimmy Donovan who lived because of it, but for everyone who's ever heard the story and recognized in it a truth we desperately need to remember. That our common humanity is stronger than our temporary hatreds, that mercy is not weakness but the highest form of strength, that the person you're taught to hate might be the person who saves your life or whose life you save, and in that saving, you both discover that you were never really enemies at all. You were just 2 people caught in circumstances neither of you created, trying to survive, trying to maintain your humanity, trying to get back to the people you love. The fellowship has now trained over 300 veterans from 42 nations, and they've built schools, dug wells, created medical clinics, trained teachers, and perhaps most importantly, formed friendships that have lasted years beyond their initial 6-month fellowship, creating networks of former warriors who now work for peace not through naive idealism but through the hard-earned wisdom that comes from having seen war up close and understanding its true cost, not in strategic objectives gained or territory captured but in the uncountable human suffering that follows every bullet fired in anger, every bomb dropped from an indifferent sky, every order given to dehumanize and destroy. In 2023, on what would have been Friedrich Weber's 102nd birthday had he lived, a group of fellowship alumni organized a peace walk along the path he'd carried Jimmy Donovan, the same 40 yards that had once been a no-man's land between trenches, now a peaceful forest where families picnic and children play, where only the memorial stone and the occasional rusted piece of ordnance unearthed by storms remind visitors that this beautiful place was once an abattoir that consumed thousands of young men in its grinding machinery of death, and as the fellows walked that path, Americans and Germans, Russians and Ukrainians, Israelis and Palestinians, people from nations that had fought each other in living memory. They carried weights on their backs, 40 pounds each, approximating what Friedrich had carried, and they did it not as a challenge or a competition but as a meditation, a physical remembering, a way of honoring both the burden Friedrich had borne and the larger burden we all bear when we choose to see each other as human beings worthy of compassion rather than as enemies deserving of destruction. Michael Donovan, Jimmy's grandson, participated in that peace walk despite being 64 years old and carrying the various aches and pains that come with aging and military service, and he did it carrying a photograph of his grandfather and Friedrich Weber, a picture that had been taken in 1997 when Jimmy had traveled to Germany for the memorial ceremony, showing the elderly American ranger standing beside a photograph of the young German soldier who'd saved his life, Jimmy's hand reaching out to touch Friedrich's image as if he could somehow reach across death itself and say thank you one more time, and Michael said afterward, his breath coming hard after the walk, sweat on his brow despite the cold December air, that he'd felt both his grandfather and Friedrich with him on that journey, felt them in every step, felt them in the ache of his shoulders and the burning of his legs, felt them reminding him that we're all carrying each other whether we acknowledge it or not, that every choice we make either adds to the burden or helps bear it, that the question isn't whether we'll face hardship and conflict. We will, that's the human condition, written into our DNA and our history, but rather how we'll respond when we do, whether we'll add to the suffering or work to alleviate it, whether we'll build walls or bridges, whether we'll see enemies or fellow travelers on this brief, difficult, beautiful journey through life. The story of Friedrich Weber and Jimmy Donovan has been told in books and documentaries, in school curricula across Germany and America, in military academies where future officers study it not as a tactical lesson but as a moral one, in churches and synagogues and mosques where religious leaders use it as an example of what their traditions call us to be, in classrooms where teachers use it to help children understand that the categories we use to divide ourselves, nationality, religion, race, political ideology, are far less important than the humanity that unites us, and in countless quiet conversations between parents and children, grandparents and grandchildren, veterans and civilians, where the story serves as a reminder that even in our darkest hours, we have choices, we have agency, we have the capacity to be better than our circumstances demand. In 2024, 80 years after that December day in the Hürtgen Forest, the Friedrich Weber Fellowship announced a new initiative. They would bring together young people who'd never served in militaries but who wanted to learn about peace-building, conflict resolution, and the kind of moral courage that Friedrich had demonstrated, expanding the mission beyond veterans to include anyone committed to the idea that our differences need not divide us, that empathy is a skill that can be learned and practiced, that the circle of who we consider us can expand until it encompasses all of humanity, and the applications poured in from every continent, from urban teenagers and rural farmers, from the privileged and the poor, from every conceivable background, all united by the recognition that in a world that seems increasingly fractured and tribal, we desperately need more stories like Friedrich and Jimmy's, more examples of people choosing connection over division, more proof that it's possible to be brave in ways that don't involve violence, to be strong in ways that don't require dominating others, to be truly heroic not by killing enemies but by refusing to have enemies at all, by insisting on seeing the humanity in everyone, even, especially, those we're told to hate. And so the story continues, transforming with each telling, finding new relevance in each generation, proving that what happened in those few desperate minutes in December 1944 wasn't just a historical curiosity or a heartwarming anecdote but something essential, something that speaks to who we are at our best and who we might become if we're brave enough to follow Friedrich Weber's example, to carry each other's burdens, to risk everything for the radical belief that every human life has value, regardless of the uniform it wears or the flag it salutes, and perhaps that's the real ending, or rather the real understanding that this story has no ending because it's still being written every day by people who choose mercy over vengeance, compassion over cruelty, love over hate, people who understand that the greatest victory in any conflict isn't defeating your enemy but transcending the very concept of enmity itself, recognizing that we're all just frightened, hopeful, flawed human beings trying to make it through this life with some measure of dignity and grace, and that the only way any of us make it is together, carrying each other when we must, being carried when we can't walk alone, creating through countless small acts of kindness and courage a world where fewer people need to be carried because fewer people are being broken by wars that serve no one except those who profit from human suffering. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us remember Friedrich Weber and Jimmy Donovan, if enough of us tell their story and live its lesson, we can build something better than what we've inherited, something worthy of the sacrifice Friedrich made and the gratitude Jimmy carried for 63 years, something that honors not just these two men, but all the countless others throughout history who've chosen humanity over hatred and paid the price gladly because they understood what we must never forget, that we are, every one of us, our brother's keeper, and that the burden of that responsibility is not a weight that breaks us but the very thing that makes us human, the very thing that makes life worth living, the very thing that ensures that even in the darkest forests, even under the most terrible fire, there is always light, there is always hope, there is always the possibility of redemption, and there is always, always the choice to carry each other home.